Do you really believe that these early Christians, these first Christians, believed that Jesus was God? I don't believe it. I know the Gospels sort of indicate that, but don't forget the Gospels were written years later, and they were reflecting what the Christian community had come to believe over the course of time, under the inspiration of the Spirit that Jesus promised to leave with our community to bring us, as he said, into all truth. I think the early disciples gradually came to understand what Jesus was all about and who Jesus was. Jesus is the way to the Father because he is God. The Father and I are one. I am the way to my Father. It's interesting that the early Christians, the early church, wasn't called church. They weren't called Christians until years later. They were called the Way. People who belonged to our group were called people of the Way. The community of believers that Jesus said was going to continue to do exactly what he was doing. That's what he meant by saying, the one who believes in me will do greater works than I have done. Because, of course, Jesus, as a human being, was very constricted. He never left his own country except, I think, 2 occasions. He went over the other side of Galilee, of the Lake of Galilee one time, and then he went up into what we call Lebanon with a short day trip and back again. So he obviously touched the lives directly of very, very few people compared to what his community has done over the centuries. What a responsibility, though, for this community, which is us. It took time to understand how to be the way. The church is always going through this self-examination to make sure that we are leading the people, leading the world on the way to the Father. For instance, in the reading today about the choosing of deacons, the deacons began to be waiters on table. The old discriminations that we see in our life today, in our culture, were still prevalent then. If you were a Jewish widow, you got meals on wheels. But if you were a Greek or you were a Hellenist widow, well, maybe there wasn't anybody coming to you that day. And so there were problems in the church, which were solved by creating a group of people called deacons, which just means waiters, people who serve. And then over the centuries, they morphed into what they did to seminarians a year before they got ordained priests. They made them deacons. And in my case, they sent me home for the summer and said, you can't do any kind of work. And we're not giving you any kind of apostolic work or pastoral work. So we were supposed to sit around all summer and twiddle our thumbs and probably get into all kinds of trouble. Well, we didn't. I didn't get in any trouble. I went to another diocese and did some pastoral work. But the point is, the church is always changing. It's morphing according to the needs of the people to whom we are called to minister. Priests. Nobody was called a priest in the early church because the Christians realized that they were all priests. Remember what we said about coming up out of baptism? You're anointed with the chrism to be a priest, a prophet, and a leader. Well, the Christians recognized that they were carrying on the priesthood of Jesus. And over the centuries, certain men, those who presided at the Eucharist, began to be called priests when it was safe to do so, when that wouldn't be confused with those pagan priests when they had all died out. So the church is always changing. The disciples are still sorting themselves out in our time, and that's why there is a bit of unrest in our church now, because certain church leaders don't agree with other church leaders on the way the church should move. Pope Francis is causing real unease among some Christians because he's too much like Jesus. He's too merciful. You know, he's not a hard liner. So the question for us as a community, and the question for us, for every single individual disciple, is how do I become more and more a way for others to the Father? Just as the church as a whole has to readjust itself to the needs of the times, individual Christians have to readjust themselves to the needs of their particular family, workplace, lifestyle, culture. Wherever we find ourselves, we are called to be the way to the Father, just as Jesus was. To be not only priests for our culture or spokesmen for God, but also leaders on the way for our contemporaries. And if you find this difficult and upsetting, well, that's good, because at least you're thinking about it and experiencing it. But always remember, the one who gave us this task, the one who called us to be the way, to do greater things than he did, also told us, I am with you always, even until the end of time.